The grill was smoking, the air was sticky, and the same playlist they used for every family function was crooning out a 2009 pop hit no one liked then and somehow liked even less now. Another year, another family barbecue. They say if you've ever been betrayed by family, hitting like brings peace, subscribing brings clarity, and commenting brings karma to those who wronged you. Try it, and tell me where you're watching from. Anyways, the kind where people wore matching t-shirts unironically, and everyone brought a side dish that was either too dry or drowning in mayonnaise. Children ran barefoot across the patchy grass while the adults circled lawn chairs like vultures around the shade. I stood near the back fence, sipping lukewarm lemonade and watching it all unfold like a script I'd seen too many times before. And center stage, as always, was Kendall. Kendall said, "I'm telling you, this is it. This role is the one. It's a SAG project. Union, streaming rights, all of it." She stood on the patio, with one arm perched on her hip like she was waiting for someone to sculpt her. Her voice sliced through the ambient chatter, commanding attention like a spotlight no one else was allowed to touch. Kendall said, "Barista number 3. I know it sounds small, but the way the director talked to me, I'm not just serving coffee, I'm serving attitude. And apparently, I've got a presence." Uncle Ron said, "Well, of course you do, sweetheart. You've always had that star power." Aunt Sharon said, "I told you from the time you were 4, you had the it factor, and now it's happening." They all laughed and cheered and clinked plastic cups together, toasting what sounded like a glorified walk-on with one line and no character name. But I just stood there, leaning against the fence post like a prop no one had decided to use. I wasn't jealous. Not in the obvious way. Not in the, I want what she has way. I just wanted space to breathe without someone else's ego sucking all the air out of the yard. No one asked what I was working on. No one even remembered that I worked in film too. That part of me had become invisible to them, edited out, like a scene they didn't think fit the story of who I was supposed to be. Aunt Sharon said, "Kendall's really making it in Hollywood. Unlike some of us." The comment wasn't subtle. It didn't need to be. It was aimed squarely at me. I glanced down at my paper plate. The macaroni salad looked congealed. I nudged it with my fork, not hungry. Cousin Greg said, "Wait, what's your line again? Say it." Kendall said, "Oh my God, okay, ready? Do you want oat or almond?" The group erupted. Uncle Ron said, "She nailed it. You hear that nuance? That delivery?" Kendall said, "Right?" And I added that little pause. They didn't even ask me to. It's called instinct. I had to bite the inside of my cheek to keep from laughing. Not out of mockery, just disbelief. That someone could spin a single line in a single scene into a full-blown performance piece at a family barbecue. I turned to walk toward the cooler, hoping for a cold drink and a colder corner to stand in. My cousin Marcy said, "Ava, weren't you in film school at some point?" I nodded and said, "Yeah. Graduated a while ago." Marcy said, "That's so cool. Are you doing like wedding videos or YouTube stuff now?" I said, "Not quite." But by the time I answered, she was already back in Kendall's orbit. It didn't matter. Nothing I said was going to be louder than Barista number 3. I walked into the house to escape the noise for a minute. The kitchen was cooler, quieter. I poured myself a fresh drink and stared out the window at the backyard. The scene, the stage, the same roles playing out every year. Kendall had always been the star, and I'd always been something else. The one behind the camcorder at Christmas, catching her twirls during talent shows. The one writing sketches while she performed monologues. The one stitching video edits late into the night while she rehearsed in the mirror. But no one ever saw the work behind the curtain. Only the girl in the spotlight mattered. Kendall said, "They told me the way I asked for the oat milk added emotional texture." She actually said that. I stood behind the curtain of the sliding glass door and watched the group gather tighter around her. Their voices lifted like applause. I looked down at my phone. There it was, the email. Subject, final cut locked from Post Supervisor, Hollow Ground. Message, Ava, the final cut's done. You nailed it. We're submitting to Tribeca, Venice, and Toronto this week. Congrats, director. I stared at it. No one out there knew that I'd just finished directing my first feature, that I'd been working on it for 3 years, that it had a budget, a crew, a real distributor already circling, that a streaming deal was in the works. No one knew, because I hadn't told them. Not because I was ashamed, but because I was done explaining my life to people who only listened when it was wrapped in glitter and noise. They wouldn't have cared when I was storyboarding at 2 a.m. They wouldn't have asked about the grants, the rejections, the rewrites, the crowdfunding, the partnerships, the night shoots, the editing deadlines. They only noticed things once they made a sound loud enough to be undeniable. And that sound was coming soon. I walked back outside. Kendall said, "The extras kept looking at me like I was somebody. I think they knew I was different." Aunt Sharon said, "Because you are, honey." I took my place back under the tree, smiled when someone offered me potato chips, nodded when they asked if I wanted more lemonade. I didn't need to say anything, not yet, because they were all about to find out. And the real scene hadn't even started. In our family, Kendall was always the star. From the time we were 5 years old, she walked into every room like it was a stage, and we were lucky to be in the audience. She was loud, sparkly, constantly performing. She didn't talk. She announced. She didn't walk. She entered. And every adult in the room seemed to stop what they were doing and beam as if they'd discovered a rare jewel. Aunt Sharon said, "Look at her go, born for the spotlight." Grandpa Joe said, "That girl's got pizzazz." "Ava, maybe you should take notes." So I did. Not the notes they wanted, but real ones. Quiet ones. In notebooks I kept stacked in my nightstand. Character sketches, little dialogues I imagined, alternate endings to every movie we watched. I wrote in margins and grocery lists and the backs of church bulletins. I observed everything. Kendall wore glitter eyeliner to school plays. I learned how to steady a camcorder in low light. She practiced monologues in front of the mirror with a hairbrush mic. I storyboarded music videos in my sketchpad. She was cast as Snow White in 2nd grade. I helped paint the set. At Thanksgiving, when our family held talent shows in the living room, Kendall sang a pop song off-key and got a standing ovation. I once read an original poem I wrote about my grandmother's garden, and when I finished, Uncle Ray said, "Sweetheart, you've got to loosen up. No one wants sad stuff at a party." Uncle Ray said, "You need more personality if you want to make it. Look at Kendall, she lights up a room." I smiled, like I was supposed to. But inside, I remember thinking, not every room needs fire. Some need light. They didn't hear me then. Not really. I learned to be fine with that. Kendall did pageants, recitals, acting workshops. Her face was in every school yearbook. Mine was on the tech crew roster, credited as camera or editing. She'd win trophies for Best Smile or Miss Personality. I'd win awards in the mail for short film submissions no one ever asked about. It wasn't even jealousy. Not exactly. It was erasure. A slow, steady message that said, if you're not loud, you don't matter. And yet, I kept creating. While Kendall was busy perfecting her signature camera-ready laugh, I was watching behind the lens, learning how to frame emotion in a single shot. While she begged our teachers to let her perform extra scenes, I was staying late in the library, researching how to write them. We graduated high school. Kendall moved to LA to be discovered. That's how she phrased it, like she'd just show up at a cafe and someone would pluck her out of the crowd, declare her the one, and roll out a red carpet. I went to film school. I didn't tell many people at first. I'd seen the way they reacted, like film school was just college light, a hobby, a phase. Aunt Sharon said, "Oh, so you're going to Hollywood too. You and Kendall should room together. I said, I'm not acting, I'm directing. She blinked. Aunt Sharon said, Isn't that kind of technical? I smiled. Exactly. Film school was everything they never expected me to survive, and everything I'd been waiting for. It was long hours, tight budgets, cruel feedback, and the first time I felt seen by people who got it, people who saw storyboards and lighting choices as art, not afterthoughts. Kendall would call every few months with updates. Kendall said, I got a callback for a toothpaste ad. Kendall said, You might see me in the background of a dance scene next season. I'm third from the left. It's huge. Each update was met with family-wide celebration, Facebook posts, group texts. Her mom would send blurry screenshots of her paused on-screen, mid-blink, and type, Our baby girl is making it. No one ever asked what I was editing, or what I'd written, or where my films were being shown. I remember once, during a family reunion, I mentioned I'd just finished directing a commercial campaign for a local nonprofit, a series of mini-documentaries about immigrant-owned bakeries and their legacy recipes. I was proud of it, deeply proud. Uncle Ron said, Oh, like a YouTube ad. I said, No, it's part of a grant partnership with the Smithsonian. He blinked. Uncle Ron said, Well, I hope they paid you something. Can't keep doing free work forever. Kendall walked in 5 minutes later and announced she'd been featured in a regional fitness ad for an off-brand energy bar. The crowd clapped like she'd won an Oscar. So I stopped bringing it up. I stopped explaining the work, because if you have to beg someone to care, it's not real care, it's curiosity. And that fades the second something shinier walks into the room. Instead, I kept building. Between freelance gigs, I directed shorts. Some won small awards, others bombed. I took on every odd job, editing wedding reels, assisting on indie sets, teaching weekend classes. I saved every penny, rewrote every script, took every note. Quietly, I was building a voice, not one they could hear, but one they would one day feel. I just had to keep going, keep trusting the work, because in our family, Kendall was the star, but I was the one holding the camera. And sooner or later, that meant I got to choose where it pointed. It started with a late-night email and a heartbeat I could hear in my ears. The subject line read, We're in if you are. The body was simple. We believe in the script. Let's make it. That was it. After 3 years of pitching in coffee shops, revising dialogue in Google Docs at midnight, applying to every obscure fellowship I could find, and surviving more rejections than I could count, I was finally getting my shot. My first feature, a gritty, intimate drama about grief, sisters, and the lies families tell to protect themselves. Raw and strange and real. The kind of story I knew wouldn't sell toys or get a Happy Meal tie-in, but the kind that sticks with people long after the credits roll. We had funding, not blockbuster numbers, but enough to shoot it right. I remember reading that email in my one-bedroom apartment, with dishes piled in the sink and my laptop balanced on a secondhand coffee table. I closed the tab, opened it again, just to be sure it was real, and I didn't tell anyone. Not because I wasn't proud, but because pride in my family had always been treated like borrowed clothing, worn with caution in case someone wanted it back. Uncle Ray once said, It's not a real movie unless it's in theaters. Aunt Sharon once said, Directing sounds like a hobby. You should look into marketing. So I didn't mention the project at all. I just got to work. We assembled a small but passionate team. My producer Malik was a powerhouse, 10 steps ahead, always. Our DP Carla had an eye like a poet. Everyone believed in the vision. No ego. No grandstanding, just artists doing the work. Casting came next. I handed it off to Malik and our casting director, Jade. We held open calls, scouted reels, took chances on unknowns. I trusted them completely, especially with the smaller roles. I didn't want to micromanage, I wanted honesty. And that's when it happened. During one of our final casting meetings, Malik called me late. Malik said, Hey, we've got Barista number 3 locked. Quick cameo role, just a few lines, but the actress has good timing. Natural delivery. I said, anyone I know? Malik said, nope. Kendall Ellis, L.A. local. Found her through a self-tape. You cool with it? I paused. Kendall Ellis? I asked. Malik said, yeah, why? And that's when it clicked. My cousin. Of course she'd go by Kendall Ellis now, dropping the last name, rebranding herself. A common move. I couldn't help but smile. I said, sure. Lock it in. I didn't tell him who she was. I didn't tell anyone. And it was almost poetic how cleanly the stars aligned. Kendall had no idea I was directing the film. My name hadn't been on any public press yet. Jade handled the auditions through a private portal. All the updates from production were internal. She'd been cast on talent alone. For once, she'd gotten the part without knowing someone. And I was holding the camera. I let the news sit inside me like a secret I didn't want to ruin by speaking aloud. It wasn't spite. It wasn't revenge. It was alignment. A beautiful accident that somehow felt fated. Because Kendall had spent years talking about Hollywood, about being close to something big. And now, she was close. She just didn't know the big thing was me. While she posted filtered selfies with captions like "actor life" and "next big thing," I was sitting in late-night editing bays, reworking storyboards, tracking our budget in color-coded spreadsheets, securing insurance forms, location permits, post-house contracts. While she waited for callbacks, I was running rehearsals. While she refreshed her inbox for casting alerts, I was rewriting scenes that would later make people cry in dark theaters. Kendall didn't need to know yet. None of them did. I'd spent so much of my life being talked over, dismissed, patronized. So much time being the quiet one, the shy one, the one with potential, that I didn't want this moment to be a rebuttal. I wanted it to stand on its own. No fanfare, no parade, just the work. We entered pre-production, finalized our shooting schedule, our locations, our blocking. Every single detail was planned down to the hour. Barista number 3 would shoot on day 4, early afternoon, in a coffee shop set we'd rented for 2 days. She'd come in, hit her marks, say her line, then she'd leave. She'd be just another face in a larger vision. But I knew. And the timing couldn't have been better. Because Kendall had no idea that the role she kept gushing about at the family barbecue, the big break that she said would change her life, was part of a story I'd written. A scene I'd rewritten 6 times. A frame I'd designed in my head long before she ever walked through that casting room door. No one in my family knew what I was building. Because they never asked. Because I stopped explaining. Because the only approval I ever really needed was from myself. And the people willing to stay in the room when the lights weren't glamorous, the budgets weren't big, and the audience hadn't arrived yet. Kendall was about to step onto my set, and neither of us was ready, but only one of us would be in charge. The coffee shop we rented for the shoot had a cozy, over-designed aesthetic. Wooden counters, vintage signage, Edison bulbs trying too hard. Perfect for the scene. Quiet, contained, intimate. It was day 4 of production. We were ahead of schedule, which never happened, so morale was high. Crew moved with that calm, focused urgency you only get when people believe in the project. Our gaffer was balancing the warmth of the key light. The sound team was checking for reverb. Extras were being placed. Everything was ready. And then she walked in. Kendall said, "Hi, sorry I'm late. Parking was a disaster. Are there any iced matcha lattes? Or is it just drip?" She was wearing a cropped jacket, designer sunglasses on top of her head like a crown, and more makeup than the camera was going to appreciate. She looked around like she was trying to spot paparazzi. Kendall said, "Which one of these is my seat?" Not like my character's seat, but where I hang out when I'm not shooting. A PA gently guided her to holding. Kendall said, "Oh, and just so you know, I added a little spin to the line. I think barista number 3 has sass. Like, she's got a life outside of oat milk, you know? She winked at the background extras like they were her fan club. One of them smiled politely. Another returned to checking his call sheet. I was in the hallway, reviewing the shot list with Carla and Malik, when our stage manager buzzed over comms. Stage manager said, "Barista's on deck. You want to make the entrance?" I didn't answer right away. Instead, I took a breath. Not because I was nervous, but because I knew this was the moment everything turned. I pushed the door open and stepped onto the set. The light was perfect. The room quieted, just slightly, as people glanced up to see who'd entered. Kendall was leaning against the counter, her phone in one hand and a smug half-smile on her face. Then she saw me. Her body stilled, her mouth parted. Kendall said, "Wait. What are you doing here?" I walked calmly toward the monitor, set my clipboard down, and looked at her directly. I said, "I'm the director." Silence. Utter, perfect silence. It spread like a ripple across the set. Eyes shifted. Whispers passed like wind between crew members. Kendall blinked. Kendall said, You're directing this?" I nodded once. Professional. Unbothered. I said, "Welcome to set. We're happy to have you." She let out a half laugh, the kind that tries to turn surprise into comedy. Kendall said, "Wow, okay. I mean, small world, right? I guess this is your big break, too." She looked around, trying to gauge if anyone else found it funny. They didn't. Malik gave her a brief smile and returned to his clipboard. Carla leaned toward me and whispered, "That's your cousin?" I whispered back, "Unfortunately." We moved into the first blocking rehearsal. I gave brief notes to the camera op, then turned to Kendall. I said, "Let's run your line." Straight delivery, minimal movement. You're not the focus of the scene, just a moment of interruption. Kendall said, "Oh, I was thinking maybe I could, lean on the counter, tilt my head." "Give it a little charm?" I said. "Let's try it without that first." Kendall said, "Totally, I'm just in the zone today." She tried to spin it, tried to smile, tried to salvage control. But the room already knew. Everyone knew. The dynamic had shifted. For the first time in our lives, I wasn't standing behind her, holding a camera. I was standing above her, calling the shots, and no amount of charm could reverse that. We did a few takes. Kendall wasn't terrible. She hit her mark. She said the line. But she wasn't brilliant either, and that was fine. She wasn't there to shine. She was there to serve the scene. She tried to improvise during take 3. Kendall said, "Oat or almond, or maybe soy if you're feeling bold." I stepped forward calmly. I said, "Let's stick to the script." Kendall said, "Of course. Just thought I'd try something. You know, options." I nodded. I said, "We've got what we need. Let's reset." She stepped back. Everyone kept working. Nobody rushed to flatter her. Nobody paused to marvel. Because on this set, the energy belonged to the story, not the performer. And I was the one protecting it. It started with a suggestion. Kendall said, "What if, just throwing this out there, I bring the coffee to the table instead of just handing it over the counter? It gives the scene movement, you know?" I was standing at the monitor, watching the playback from the last take, where she'd already ad-libbed a wink that wasn't in the script. I said, "Let's keep it to the blocking we discussed. The main character's emotional beat is here. We don't want the moment to shift." Kendall said, Totally. Just wanted to offer something organic." She smiled like she expected applause. There wasn't any. We reset. She gave another take, slightly exaggerated inflection, a raised eyebrow that didn't belong to the character. It wasn't subtle. I turned to Carla. I whispered, "Is she playing barista number 3 or auditioning for a sitcom?" Carla didn't laugh, but her lips twitched. We rolled another. Kendall said, "Do you want oat, or are you feeling almond adventurous?" I stepped forward before the camera even cut. I said, "Let's stick to the story we agreed on." Kendall said, "Oh, right. My bad. Just wanted to give you options." She laughed. A soft, performative chuckle that had worked at every family gathering. But here? It bounced against the walls and fell flat. Crew members stayed professional. No eye rolls, no sighs, just focus. Because they respected me, not because I was loud, or flashy, or charming, but because I was clear. I didn't bark orders. I didn't raise my voice. I gave notes calmly, thoughtfully. I thanked the team between takes. I asked questions. I listened. I made decisions. My vision didn't need volume. It needed clarity. And that's exactly what it had. Kendall tried 2 more takes with slight variations. Tiny improvisations. A purse of the lips. A dramatic pause before the word oat. She delivered them like offerings, waiting for me to light the match and praise the fire. I didn't. I said, "Let's go back to take 2. That was clean." Kendall said, "So, we're not going with the extra stuff?" I said, "We're telling a grounded story. Every second counts." She nodded. Her smile tightened. She adjusted her collar and stepped back to holding. And that was it. That was all she got. 1 scene, 2 lines. A quiet handoff of coffee that served the narrative without stealing it. The rest of the day went smoothly. We wrapped ahead of schedule. The real actors nailed their scenes. I remember standing behind the monitor for the final shot that day, watching something click into place. Kendall wasn't in it. She left without saying goodbye. That night, I sat on my balcony with my laptop open and a cup of tea in hand. I watched her scene again, just to be sure. I toggled between the takes, measured her performance not against the family version of her, but the editorial one. She was fine, passable, not memorable. She'd done what the script required and nothing more. I made a folder and labeled it Barista number 3, Raw. Then I cut it down. Not with vengeance, not out of spite, just truth. The trimmed version worked better. The shorter take kept the scene moving. Her ad-libs felt forced, unearned. Her improvisations undercut the tone. And that long pause she thought was dramatic? It killed the pacing. I dragged the take onto the timeline, trimmed the edges, watched the moment land perfectly. Then I saved it. She didn't need to know. She wouldn't know until the screening, and by then it would be framed by the entire story. The one I had written. The one I had directed. The one I had built from scratch. She thought she was part of something small. But this film? It was the biggest thing I'd ever made. And she was just a frame. I don't say that to be cruel. I say it because it was finally true. For once, I got to decide how the story was told. The group chat had been buzzing for days. Kendall said, "So excited for the premiere. Can't wait to see everyone there." Kendall said, "Make sure to dress elevated chic. There's going to be press, red carpet. This is major." She followed up with a mirror photo of herself in a silver sequined jumpsuit and dramatic heels, holding a clutch like it was a trophy. Kendall said, "Just a little something I threw together. Indie vibes, but make it iconic." Aunt Sharon said, "We are so proud of you. You've worked so hard for this moment." Uncle Ron said, "Our little movie star." No one asked me if I'd be attending. No one mentioned the director, because in their minds, Kendall was the movie. Barista number 3 had somehow eclipsed the entire production. I didn't correct them. I didn't need to. The theater was packed. The festival had given us one of the coveted slots, prime time, Saturday night, with a lead-in by a film that had already picked up 2 critics' awards. There were badges everywhere. Lanyards, notebooks, hushed conversations between producers and programmers in the lobby. I arrived early through the side entrance. I always do. Not because I wanted to avoid anyone, but because I like seeing the room before it sees me. Kendall arrived in a flurry of energy and perfume, snapping a photo against the step and repeat and gesturing her family into poses with her. Aunt Sharon was in heels too high for her comfort. Uncle Ron had bought a new blazer. Kendall beamed through it all. Kendall said, "I just can't believe this is happening. I mean, it's just one scene, but the camera really catches me. You'll see." They found their seats near the center row. I stayed near the back, with the crew. Malik turned to me and whispered, "You ready for this?" I said, "More than ever." The lights dimmed, the logo hit the screen, and the story began. No opening speech, no introduction, just silence, and then sound, image, color, emotion. From the first shot, the room leaned in. Our lead actress, an unknown just a year ago, commanded the screen with a quiet force that pulled you straight into her grief. Every frame was intentional, every cut clean. The lighting was intimate, the pacing sharp. The audience was still. You could feel the weight of their focus. About 30 minutes in, Kendall's scene arrived. She appeared behind the counter, cheerful, oblivious, offering oat or almond milk to a protagonist deep in despair. She hit her mark, said the line, and then the story moved on. No applause, no gasps, just transition. Exactly as it was designed. Kendall shifted in her seat. I could see her profile from the back row. Upright, alert, waiting for more. But there wasn't more. Because that was the whole part. The rest of the film unfolded like a quiet confession. It dealt with guilt, memory, and the small betrayals that live in family homes. People cried. People clutched their programs. Someone near the front whispered, "Wow," during a pivotal monologue in Act 3. Then the music swelled, fade to black, and the credits began. Names scrolled in silence, and then 3 seconds in, directed by Ava Sinclair. My name, centered, full screen. The silence broke. I heard a single gasp. Aunt Sharon said, "Wait, Ava directed this?" She said it too loudly. Several heads turned. Uncle Ron said, "I thought Kendall said this was her project." Kendall didn't say anything. She was frozen in her seat, mouth slightly open, hands still on her knees. She wasn't prepared. None of them were. The room applauded, not politely, genuinely. A standing ovation started near the front and moved toward the middle. The crew stood up. The lead actress wiped her eyes. Malik gestured for me to go down the aisle. I didn't rush. I stood slowly, calmly, and walked to the front. The festival coordinator met me at the bottom step of the stage. She said, "Your work speaks for itself. They're going to be talking about this one." I took the mic, thanked the audience, thanked the cast, the crew, the backers, the post team, everyone who helped make it possible. But I didn't mention Kendall. I didn't need to. Afterward, in the lobby, the crowd buzzed with excitement. Critics scribbled notes. A distributor pulled Malik aside for a conversation. Crew members hugged me. A few up-and-coming directors asked for meetings. My family approached cautiously. Aunt Sharon said, "Ava, this was unbelievable. Why didn't you tell us?" I smiled and said, "I wanted the work to speak first." Uncle Ron said, "You really pulled this off." "We had no idea." I said, "That's okay. You do now." Kendall stood behind them, quiet, eyes glossy. She walked up and adjusted her bag strap. Kendall said, "Great job. I guess we both made it, huh?" I looked at her, held her gaze, and said, "You were great in the scene. Thanks for being part of it." That was it. Polite, graceful, firm. And then I turned back to a producer asking if I'd be open to adapting the story for streaming. Kendall didn't follow. She stayed where she was, half in the light, half in the noise, realizing, maybe for the first time, that being seen is not the same as being known. The moment the credits ended, the mood changed, like someone had turned up the volume on a different frequency, one where I suddenly mattered. People who hadn't looked at me twice during Kendall's pre-show photo ops were now cutting through the lobby with urgency in their step, voices bright with something between surprise and performance. Aunt Sharon said, "Ava! Oh my goodness, why didn't you say anything? We had no idea." She grabbed my hands like I'd returned from war. I said, "I wanted you to experience the story first." Uncle Ron said, "This is huge. You directed this? I mean, this was real, like a real movie." I nodded. That was the goal. Behind them, Kendall stood quietly, still in her silver jumpsuit, still holding her clutch, but the spark that had animated her before the screening had dimmed. She was sipping champagne slowly, eyes watching the room swirl around me. The cluster of people asking about development rights, press inquiries, international distribution, it didn't move toward her. It moved around her, like a river splitting at a rock. I saw her watching that, and I knew that feeling, the stillness of being overlooked. Except I hadn't walked through this night to rub that in. So when she finally stepped forward, I didn't brace. I stayed still. Kendall said, "Great job, seriously, the film's amazing." I nodded. She added, "I guess we both made it, huh?" I smiled gently. I said, "You were great in the scene. Thanks for being part of it." She blinked. That wasn't the response she was hoping for. It didn't give her an entry point back into the center. It didn't diminish her. But it didn't elevate her either. It was just true. Kendall said, "It's kind of surreal. I had no idea you were even doing this, like this level." I said, "I've been doing this for a long time, just not loud about it." She nodded, mouth tight. Well, it paid off. Then she excused herself to the other side of the lobby, where a group of distant cousins was still asking if she had any more lines, or might be in the sequel. I watched her go, and for a second, I felt the old tug. Something between guilt and self-erasure. The part of me that wanted to shrink so others could feel big. But it passed. Because for once, I didn't have to choose between being kind and being true. I could be both. The rest of the family came in waves. Cousin Marcy said, "I didn't realize you were even still in film. Last I heard you were doing editing?" I said, "Still doing that. Just also directing now." Aunt Sharon said, "You should have said something sooner. We could have supported you." I smiled, not unkindly. I said, "I think this was the best way." Because if I had told them before, it would have been diminished. If I had mentioned the shoot, they would have made it about Kendall's cameo. If I had said I was directing a feature, they would have asked if it was for YouTube. Now, they couldn't rewrite the story. They had seen it, felt it, and I didn't have to explain anything. I excused myself to grab water. My throat was dry from answering the same 5 questions. Malik caught up with me by the drinks table. Malik said, "You handled that beautifully, especially the cousin part." I said, "Years of practice." Malik said, "You sure you don't want to take a bow up there again? They're waiting on you." I looked at the crowd, family and strangers alike, now mingling, now interested. And I realized I wasn't performing anymore. I was present. The difference was everything. I said, "They know now. That's enough." The event wound down slowly. People filtered out into the cool evening air. A few asked for selfies. A few handed me cards. A festival judge said he wanted to talk after the weekend. My family gathered by the exit, still humming with residual shock. Uncle Ron said, "Really proud of you, Ava. You've got the gift." Aunt Sharon said, "We should throw a little dinner. Celebrate properly. It's not every day we have a star in the family." I smiled and said, "Let's see. My schedule's a little full right now." And it was, not with arrogance, but with purpose. I hugged a few people, thanked others, gave brief, honest answers, and then I left. Not early, not late, Just when I was ready, Kendall stood by the curb, waiting for her ride. She didn't look up. That was okay too. I didn't need her recognition, or anyone's. I had the work. I had the truth. And for the first time in my life, they all remembered me. Not because I was trying to be seen, but because I finally stopped asking. It happened slowly, then, all at once. The morning after the screening, I woke up to 87 unread emails. Most with subject lines like, "Loved Hollow Ground, let's talk. Are you repped yet?" Director Ava Sinclair, interview request. By the end of the week, we were shortlisted for 2 festival awards, invited to pitch at a distribution summit in Berlin, and trending in a niche Twitter thread titled, "The Women Behind the Quiet Revolution in Indie Film." None of it felt like a victory lap. It felt earned. Like bricks laid carefully over time were finally revealing the foundation I had been quietly building for years. The panels came next. Women in film, emerging voices, directing intimacy on screen. Suddenly I was in rooms I'd never been invited into before, not as an intern, not as an assistant, but as the speaker, as the director. And everywhere I went, someone mentioned that film, the way it held silence, the honesty of the performances, the restraint, the framing, my vision, my name on the screen. At one panel in New York, after I'd spoken about crafting character through composition, a young woman approached me, eyes wide and hopeful. She said, "I didn't know people like me could do this. Until I saw your film." I think that meant more than all the reviews combined, because I'd spent so long trying to prove myself to the wrong audience, my family, their metrics, their expectations. But now I was connecting with people who saw me, not just what I did, but how I did it, the way I led, the way I built something out of what they never thought counted. Back home, the family's tone had shifted. Uncle Ron said, "Next time you do a project, let me know. I've got a buddy who runs a local film fund." Aunt Sharon said, "We were just bragging about you at church. I told them my niece is a real director now." I smiled politely each time, thanked them, replied with short, warm sentences. But I didn't invite them in, not the way I used to wish I could, because they weren't clapping for me. They were clapping for who I'd become now that I was standing where they could finally see me. Their recognition was nice, but it wasn't needed. I stopped answering every message. I stopped performing gratitude for things I'd already earned. Instead, I focused on the work. We were greenlit for a second feature. I signed with a literary agent. And one quiet Wednesday afternoon, while clearing out a drawer of old DVDs, I found the original cut of Hollow Ground, still in its paper sleeve. Unlabeled, just raw truth. And an idea came to me. I printed a copy of the official DVD, final festival version, wrapped in matte black with the title embossed in silver. I slid it into a padded envelope, wrote the address by hand. No card, just a sticky note inside the case, right beneath the disc. On it, I wrote, "To Barista number 3, you brewed it well. Ava." I didn't send it out of malice. It wasn't a jab. It was a gesture of closure, because Kendall had always wanted the spotlight, and I had finally realized I didn't need it. She bragged about one scene, but I was the one behind the camera calling cut. I didn't need the spotlight. I owned the story. If you enjoyed the story, make sure to subscribe for good luck.